What's up, everybody? There are certain homes that I would never, ever buy. After working in real estate for 21 years, yes, I am that old, I see houses that I'm sure nobody's ever gonna buy them. And then somebody does. And I just sit there and I shake my head and I wonder if they actually regret it. Because you know what? I bet they do. So today, I'm gonna share with you my opinion of homes you should never buy and hopefully prevent you from making a big mistake. And stay tuned till the end because my last one, it might just surprise you. So let's dive right in. Buying a house today is super expensive and the last thing you want is to regret it. And quite honestly, people get so caught up in the frenzy of buying a house that they start to compromise on what they really want. There have been times where I've told my clients that if they buy this house, they will have problems when they go to sell it later. After that, if they want to buy it, well, at least they've been forewarned. Honestly, I don't think any of them actually bought the house after I told them the issues they would have on reselling it. The first type of house that you should never buy is a house that has a mold problem. Now you may be thinking, this is a no-brainer, but there are many different types of mold, some more dangerous than others. Some mold is easy to see. You see brown or black spots on the ceiling of the shower or in the unfinished basement room or under the sink. Sometimes it's benign and easy to clean with a bleach product. Other times, mold is in the crawl space and is really hard to access. And then there are the situations where you don't really know about the mold because you can't see it. The house smells super musty, but you don't see any mold when you look around. I had a client once who was buying a really expensive home here in Bethesda, Maryland. The house was listed for $1.3 million. He loved this house, but it smelled super musty. Now, granted, the sellers had moved out and old empty houses can smell musty if nobody's been in and out of the house for a while. I pointed out to him that I think this is more than just an old, empty, musty house smell, and I encouraged him to tell the inspector about my suspicions. We wrote the contract contingent on a 3-day yes or no home inspection, and it was accepted. The inspector came with a moisture meter since there wasn't enough time to do a proper mold test. Because when you do a mold test, it'll take about 2 to 3 business days up to a week to get the results back from the lab. A moisture meter will be able to tell you the level of moisture behind the walls, the floor, any surface. When the inspector put that moisture meter on the wall of the powder room, it went crazy. There was no access to see what was behind the wall without making a hole in the drywall. There was no visible mold on the walls, but it had been painted recently, so there could have been before. We just couldn't see it now. One thing was obvious is that there was definitely a moisture problem. The inspector advised my client to do a proper mold test to confirm what's behind the wall. We asked the seller and they said no, they would not give us the extra time we needed to do a mold test. Another big red flag. My client chose to cancel the contract within that 3 days, and I have to say, I was so relieved. Mold can be really scary. It can cause a lot of very serious health problems depending on the kind of mold. This is why it is super important to have an inspection when you buy a house. Or if you don't have time, at least bring an inspector with you when you go see the house and make sure they bring a moisture meter. If that's also not an option, because I know in today's housing market, some markets are still super competitive and a seller's market, then buy one yourself and really learn how to use it and what the proper acceptable moisture levels are for each surface. The next house I would never buy is one where there is an oil tank buried underground. We have this here in Maryland, especially in houses that are built between 1900 and 1985. The seller is obligated to disclose if there is a buried oil tank on the property, and they must remove it or abandon it. If you are planning on buying a house with a buried oil tank and it has been abandoned but not removed, I strongly recommend asking the seller to remove the oil tank before you close on that house. Once the tank is removed, make sure you test the soil because contaminated soil is no joke. Leaking oil can cause respiratory problems if it released volatile organic compounds or VOCs into the air. Liver and kidney damage if the oil leaked into groundwater, contaminating drinking water supplies, and possible increased cancer risk. It's just not worth it. And if the seller won't remove the abandoned tank, then I would definitely not buy buy that house. But if you are determined to buy this house, do me a favor, contact a home insurance company before you write the contract to make sure they will insure the house, because some insurance companies may require you to remove the tank before they will insure it, and this can be really expensive, especially if you do it right and test the soil afterwards. The cost can range from $1,500 to $3,000 for a basic tank removal with no leaks or contamination, and it could be $10,000 to $50,000 or more if there is soil contamination and extensive remediation. To be honest, even if the tank was removed, I still probably wouldn't buy that house. There are just too many unknowns that a leaky tank can cause, and it's just not worth it to me. The next house that I would never buy is one that is located in a flood zone. Believe it or not, where I'm located, right outside of Washington, D.C., there are neighborhoods that are technically in flood zones. I had a client who bought a house in Kensington, which is located right outside of D.C., that backed to a creek and was in a designated flood zone. The home insurance was going to be a much bigger payment than they were willing to spend. We actually fought the zoning with FEMA and asked for the house to be reclassified. In this case, we actually won. It was new construction, and the builder had already started the process with FEMA, which can take up to 60 days to review. We wrote in the contract that it was contingent upon the reclassification of the flood zone. So in this case, it did all work out. But if we didn't have that contingency and the house did not get reclassified, my clients have been stuck with a huge insurance payment that they didn't want, and it would be a huge pill to swallow for the next buyer. Besides a huge insurance premium, there are other problems with living in a flood zone. You have a higher risk of mold, mildew, property damage from flooding, as well as a lower resale value, as these homes can be harder to sell. Now, there are different categories of floodplains that range from Zone AE, which is the most common high-risk flood zone, also known as the 100-year floodplain. It has a 1% chance of flooding in any given year, which is also referred to as the base flood, to Zone 5, coastal high hazard areas, which has a high risk of flooding, or 1% or greater chance of flooding each year, similar to other high-risk zones, but with the added danger of strong storm waves. Personally, I would never buy a house in any of these categories or zones. It's just too risky, and who needs all that worry about possible flooding and damage? Plus, like I said, when you go to sell that house, you're gonna have the same issues with finding buyers that are okay to live in a flood zone. The next one is tricky. I would never buy a house that backs to power lines. We have a lot of neighborhoods that back to power lines, so this can come up quite often where I live. So far, science has been unable to substantiate health risks from exposure to power lines, especially if the home is at least 200 feet from the high electromagnetic fields, or EMFs. This is all very relative, so definitely do your due diligence if you're thinking about buying a house that backs to power lines. Make sure you're comfortable with it. That being said, even if the actual risk is low, the perceived health risk by potential future buyers can be enough to affect the property's value. All you have to do is Google it, and the headlines alone can be scary. All I see is cancer, cancer, cancer. Now, there are some people that actually really enjoy having their house back to power lines. They are assured there will be no neighbors behind them. It's quiet, and they enjoy their privacy. But when they go to sell, it can be a huge problem. It's the unknown that taints the house and affects the resale value. So it's a no for me. Although the thought of no neighbors behind me does sound really nice. And while we're talking about location, I would never buy a home that backs to the highway. We have both 495, the Beltway, and 270 here in Montgomery County, and in order to live close to DC, you may have to compromise on this one. But given the choice, I would never buy one of these houses. Besides the noise, pollution, and overall ugliness of looking at a highway from my back deck, the resale value will be immediately compromised. Even in a competitive market, homes that back to the highway are still harder to sell. Now, would I buy a house that's a few streets away from a highway? Yes, I would. Like I said, sometimes you can't help but be pretty close to a highway if you want to be in a certain neighborhood due to the schools or proximity to a city, in my case, DC. But I would never, ever buy a home that backs to a highway. Hard pass. So we have a couple more, although I could go on and on about houses that I wouldn't buy, but that would be a really long video. The next house I would never buy is the most expensive, fanciest house in the neighborhood. You might think, hey, I'll get the nicest house in the block. But here's the thing, there's more to it than that. First off, there's a ceiling on how much that house can appreciate, especially if the rest of the neighborhood isn't keeping up. If the homes around yours are less expensive and not as well maintained, it can drag down the value of your place, no matter how nice it is. And then there's the resale issue. When it comes time to sell, if your house is way more expensive than all the others, you might struggle to find buyers who are willing to spend that extra cash. They'll be looking at your house and thinking, why should I pay so much more when I can get something similar in the same neighborhood for less money? Plus, let's say you want to do some upgrades, maybe a new kitchen or a fancy backyard. You're likely not going to get that money back because the surrounding homes kind of cap how much value you can add. It's what they call over improvement, and it's a real thing. And here's another thing. If your place is way nicer than the rest, you may feel a little out of place with the neighbors. It can feel a little awkward when your house is that standout house, and not necessarily in a good way. You might not vibe with the neighborhood as much, and that can impact how much you enjoy living there. So the bottom line, sometimes it's better to pick a nice house in a great neighborhood where there's room for it to grow in value, rather than going all out on the best house that may not give you the best return in the long run. One more and then we'll get to my last one. I would never buy a flipped house unless I had a structural engineer inspect it. When investors flip houses, they are focused on the cosmetic, fixing the kitchen and bathrooms as cheaply as possible and as quickly as possible. Sometimes that means they rush things or use cheaper materials. And while everything may look shiny on the surface, there could be problems lurking underneath. You know, like plumbing that's just been patched up or electrical work that's not quite up to code. Then there's the whole issue of hidden problems. Some flippers may cover up problems instead of properly repairing them, such as painting over mold, covering cracks with drywall, or using low quality materials that look good initially, but they won't last. And let's be real, flipped houses are often priced higher because you are paying for their renovations. But if the work wasn't done well, you could be overpaying big time. So if you are considering buying a flipped house, please do your homework, get a thorough inspection, check that everything was done by the book, and make sure you're not just falling for the fresh paint and shiny new countertops. My advice, bring a structural engineer. If everything checks out, awesome. You've got a move-in ready home. But if not, you may be signing up for more trouble than it's worth. And finally, I would never buy a home in an HOA. Now, this can be tricky depending on where you live and the age of the home. I did an entire video on HOAs and the real regrets that people have who bought them. We go over the problems of buying a house in an HOA and how you can protect yourself if you are thinking about buying a house within one. So if you want to hear more about that, I encourage you to go watch that video right now. It may shock you what happened to these people. I know it really shocked me. I hope you got some value to today's video. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. Bye!